All right, let's just dive right into the source material. Today, we are unpacking something that literally tackles the ultimate question of existence. We're going to do a deep dive into a really fascinating, newly published framework from 2026 known as the NKE Theory. It's this radical attempt to explain absolutely everything in the universe, starting from one single, infinitely simple starting point. So if you're into structured, logical deep dives into the pure nature of reality, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's get into it.
So, what is the answer to everything? I mean, it's the Holy Grail, right? For decades, the most brilliant minds on the planet have been hunting for a theory of everything, or a TOE. We all just want that one single rule, that one elegant equation, or maybe one fundamental process that perfectly unites the entire universe, from the tiniest, jumpy, microscopic quantum realm all the way up to those massive swirling galaxies.
Now, obviously, if you ask the galactic supercomputer Deep Thought from Douglas Adams' classic sci-fi, the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is, well, 42. It's a fantastic joke, but it actually highlights a really serious point. Even if someone hands us the ultimate answer on the silver platter, it doesn't mean much of anything if we don't understand the fundamental process behind it. So let's take a look at the serious scientific search for that process.
Which brings us to Section 1, the search for everything.
To really grasp this search, we first have to acknowledge exactly where our current models hit a brick wall. Look, the standard model of physics is incredible, no doubt about it, but it really struggles to unite the four fundamental forces. Specifically, it has a surprisingly hard time marrying the smooth, continuous laws of gravity with the highly probabilistic laws of quantum mechanics. Notice the stark contrast in how we actually try to solve this problem. Over on the mainstream physics side, we rely on things like complex string theory or loop quantum gravity, stuff that requires intense mind-bending mathematics and hidden extra dimensions. But on the alternative side, thinkers take a completely different path. Thomas Campbell's My Big Toe places consciousness as the foundational reality. Chris Langen's CTMU uses a self-configuring logical language. And then we have this very new edition published in 2026 by Arndt Michael Meyer, the NKE Theory.
All right, Section 2, NK and the Busfo Process.
This brings us to a radically minimalist approach. So NKEA actually stands for the German phrase Nichts Crust etwas, which translates to nothing, crust, something. Now, what's wild here is that this theory explicitly strips away complex mathematics, extra dimensions, hidden particles, and even consciousness from its foundation. Instead, it relies on one single tautological cycle called the Busfo Process. Here's how it works in 4 steps. First, there's absolute nothing. Second, an infinitely thin crust separates this nothing into 2 parts. Third, because of this separation, a minimal difference between the 2 sides starts to grow. And finally, the difference just becomes way too great, the tension maxes out, and the crust breaks, triggering an equalization process. Boom, that's it. It's an infinitely fast, omnipresent cycle. Nichts Crust etwas. Nothing, crust, something.
Moving on to Section 3, how physics emerges. So you're probably wondering, how on earth do we get from that super abstract, pre-physical cycle to actual physical reality? Well, NKA argues that this single process fractally scales up to create a vibrating, 3-dimensional Busfo grid. Basically, everything we know is physical reality. Space, time, matter, the whole shebang is just emergent resonance patterns vibrating on this grid. And notice how this fundamentally redefines what a force actually is. In standard physics, we often think of forces as particles acting at a distance. But NKA says no, absolutely not. Forces are just structural limits of resonance on that grid. The strong force isn't some pulling particle, it's simply the lower limit of grid stability. The weak force is the upper limit of instability, right where structures start breaking down. Gravity is the interaction of the entire background grid with the structures inside it, and electromagnetism, that's just the direct interaction between those structures. It's incredibly elegant, honestly. Everything is just structure touching structure.
But here's where things get philosophically sharp. Some physicists, like Max Tegmark, argue that the universe is literally mathematics. But NK points out a massive logical flaw in that idea. Pure math is totally static. Think about it. X plus 1 equals X plus 1. That is a timeless, static identity. But the actual universe, especially down below the Planck scale, is wildly dynamic. It demands continuous unfolding processes. The universe isn't a static equation. It's a dynamic converging process. Mathematics is merely the descriptive language we use to model it.
Let's look at Section 4, NKE, SBT, and KLAS.
Scaling up from that fundamental level, Meyer's theories form this massive hierarchical dependence. The core argument is that this crust difference break cycle is actually a fractal pattern that scales all the way up to build the macro universe. And supposedly, it even shapes human behavior. Down at the very base, we have NKE, the physics and ontology. From that emerges the SBT, or small bang theory, which argues that planets, moons, and even life itself form through this exact same cycle, a crust forming, tension building, and a localized small bang occurring. And finally, sitting all the way at the top, we have KLS. This is a strategic model of human behavior that categorizes us into camels, lions, eagles, or turtles, all supposedly emerging from that exact same biological drive. Quite the leap, right?
Now, let's step back for a second and be completely objective. Imagine you're a spaceship observer, just floating neutrally out there between our sun and Alpha Centauri. To you, the base NKE theory might actually seem universally applicable, but as we scale up to planetary creation and specifically to this Earth-centric human psychology stuff, the theory becomes very, very localized. Critics could definitely point out that linking a universal theory of everything so tightly to human behavior models makes the overall framework look a bit top-heavy and, frankly, incredibly Earth-centric.
Which takes us to Section 5, the unsolvable logical problem.
We absolutely need to impartially analyze the greatest hurdle for NKE. And honestly, this is the hurdle for almost every theory of everything ever proposed, the ontological phase change. How in the world do you jump from the Busfo process, which, remember, is infinitely fast and completely timeless, across this massive logical gap, into a physical universe that is strictly bound by time, energy, and the speed of light? You somehow have to explain how time itself emerges from timelessness without smuggling in any hidden rules. It's a massive challenge.
NKE attempts to bridge this gap by defining its foundational process using the concept of infinity. So, an infinitely fast process, an infinitely thin crust. But from a purely logical standpoint, a limit approaching infinity is a mathematical idealization. It's not an actual physical state. Convergence is not exact reality. So by pushing the origin of physics into infinity, the theory elegantly packages the problem up, sure, but a strict logician might argue that it simply relocates the impossible leap rather than actually solving it.
And finally, Section 6, Temporary Absolute Truth. What makes this framework really compelling, though, is its self-awareness of its own logical limits. It actually includes specific philosophical tools to deal with the boundaries of human understanding. And this brings us to a concept Meyer calls Tao, which stands for Temporary Absolute Truth. Because of mathematical proofs like Gödel's incompleteness theorems, we know for a fact that perfect, eternal truth in any formal system is literally unreachable. So Tao acts as an epistemological rule. We basically agree to treat this framework as absolutely true for our current level of understanding just so that we can work with it. But we do this fully accepting that it must be revised at the very moment a deeper emergent truth is discovered. It's a very honest, practical way to do science.
And this all sits under the ultimate guiding principle of the entire theory, summarized as WAF, Wahrheit als Fundament, or truth as foundation. This is an uncompromising methodological rule dictating that truth must always supersede elegance, popularity, or convenience. It is a strict commitment to continually searching, questioning, and breaking the crust of our own understanding to get to the real mechanisms of the universe.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. Douglas Adams gave us the answer 42 to point out a fundamental flaw in our thinking. An answer is entirely useless if you don't actually understand the question you're asking. The NKE theory, with its minimal Busfo process, its dynamic structures, and its temporary absolute truths, is a truly fascinating, structured attempt to finally figure out what the ultimate question of existence actually is. Have we found it yet? Well, maybe not perfectly, but theories like this prove we are absolutely getting better at asking it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the source material, and remember, keep asking the big questions.